Andrew Binns, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Hi, Jonathan. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. You're joining us from Massachusetts. I'm here in Utah. We're going to have an opportunity to have a really nice discussion. Today, we're going to focus on leading disruption by ideating, incubating, and scaling new businesses inside existing organizations. I love this topic. I'm super excited to pick your brain on this and to have a really good conversation. As we get started, go ahead.
No, super. It's very, very delighted to have that conversation.
Yes.
Good.
As we get started, I wanted to share Andrew's bio with everybody. Andrew Binns is the co-founder and managing principal at ChangeLogic, a strategic innovation advisory firm focusing on helping CEOs and senior teams better run their organizations. Andy has over 30 years of expertise in corporate entrepreneurship, innovation, and the future of business. He most recently has worked with clients, a big laundry list of really top-notch clients, and is also a frequent guest speaker and lecturer both for companies and business schools. Andy has published widely, including as a co-author of 3 Disciplines of Innovation in the California Management Review, named Best Article in 2020, and ambidextrous CEO in the Harvard Business Review, The Art of Strategic Renewal, and MIT Sloan Management Review, and a book chapter on getting started with ambidextrity. I'll say that part again. And a book chapter on getting started with ambidexterity. He is an executive fellow in the Center for Future Organization at the Drucker School of Management. What a tremendous and terrific background. It is really a pleasure to be with you today. As we get started, anything else you would like to share with listeners by way of your background or personal context?
Yeah, we're going to talk about building new businesses in existing organizations. What I like to think of as the work of a corporate explorer, right? We talk a lot about entrepreneurs and startups, and the corporate explorer for me started in 2000 when I was at IBM, and I met this woman called Carol Kovac, who was creating a new business around life sciences, and she just created what became a multi-billion-dollar business within IBM. And it seems to me we spend a lot of time thinking about entrepreneurs and not enough time thinking about what people can do to be great corporate explorers. And I think it's very personal in terms of the leader for me, as we talk about this, Carol and many others that we'll talk about that I've seen. So that's the focus of my work, essentially.
Very good. And I love the framing of the corporate explorer.
Thank you.
That's really captures it quite well.
Right.
And we talk a lot about entrepreneurship and the role of entrepreneurs in driving innovation and the challenges around scaling a new venture. So many challenges there. And so I like how you and your organization also focus on how to do that within existing corporate structures, because you have the resources, you have the information, the intellectual property, you have the human capital, you have all the stuff there needed to be able to really do some cool things. And I think a lot of times we get too stuck in kind of the traditional corporate mode and just kind of going on with the status quo. And if we can break out of that a little bit, we can do some really awesome stuff.
That's right. And I think we let ourselves believe some myths about why corporations don't innovate. We let ourselves believe that that the reason that a firm like, say, Nokia gets disrupted in mobile phones, or famously Kodak in digital photography, we want to believe that that's because they don't see it coming, right? Or maybe they see it, but they don't believe that it's going to be that important. Neither of these things are really true. Kodak had a huge focus on becoming the best in digital. Nokia absolutely had a smartphone and understood what was coming down the pike. It's that they cannot act. It's a question of action and execution, not of insight. And that's a hard message, because it means we can't externalize it. We can't make it about somebody else. It's actually about us in organizations and what we do. And that I think is the big sort of challenge that this field has.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always all about action. So clearly we need to be doing strategic planning. We need to talk to lots of people. We need to try to look around the corner as best we can to see trends as they're developing and as they're coming towards us. But ultimately, we can do that all day long. But if we can't implement and we can't move it into action, then of course nothing's going to really happen. So we're going to break this down a little bit. We're going to talk about leading disruption with some of these different components that I know your organization focuses on: ideating, incubating, and scaling, and doing all of that within inside an existing organization. So let's start with ideation. Define that for us a little bit, and maybe an example or two, and then we can see how that creates a foundation for everything that we're going to try to do.
So ideation is at one level the fun part of innovation, right? And for some people, this is all it's about. It's about creating great ideas to solve important customer problems, right? And so those ideas can come from lots of different places. They could come from employees and employee participation and hackathons and maybe some design thinking and all of this great stuff. They could come from R&D. We've worked with a number of clients who are particularly technical ones, for whom the R&D department remains the primary source of ideas. Or they could come from open innovation or crowds or things of this nature. But it doesn't really matter where they come from. What matters is, are these ideas that you actually want, right? So one of the big breakdowns in organizations is that we innovate or ideate too broadly without necessarily observing, is this something that we want strategically, that we're actually going to invest in? And it's astonishing how many organizations that we go into are actually spending money on innovation to do lots of little projects. And they're there, they have people working on them, they're invested, but only a little bit, only enough to kind of almost to entertain, right? So ideation is a lot to do with idea generation, but it's also about having the right hunting zones, the places where you want to find areas of opportunity. So let me give you an example. We worked the last few years with a European insurance firm, and their in hunting zone was how they could help their customers live longer, healthier, safer lives. And so we broke that down into get healthy and stay healthy, right? And under get healthy, there's a big question in Europe of access to primary healthcare. So we built out some different options for doing what turned out to be very helpful, remote healthcare businesses and so on. And in stay healthy, elderly care, mental health, and again, something that's turned out to be very important contribution right now that they did. So what they were then able to do is to focus ideation into what are they going to do in those areas. It sort of narrows the focus and allows you to generate ideas, and then they could use crowdsourcing, sprint teams, and all the rest of it to make it work.
Yeah, excellent. And I really like how you mentioned the tinkering element that a lot of organizations seem to be doing with the ideation stage. You have these little teams working on things that realistically, does this fit within the strategic vision of the organization at all? Yeah. And I get it to a point because sometimes you don't know, what the next great thing will be that could take you in a new direction, different than what your current strategy is. So I get that, but how much time, energy, resources can be wasted on some of those things? On the one hand, on the flip side, like, okay, if you're going to go explore in these areas, support it enough, like put enough resources into it so it can actually become something. Because if you're only investing at a really minute level, the chances of that developing into something more is just so slim. And so I see that a lot too. I think ultimately we as large corporations, large organizations, we do want to find ways to ideate and come up with really cool ideas. Yes. But focus is like you said, absolutely what we need to do. And I think about things like companies like Apple. I mean, Apple could do a zillion things if they wanted to. They're a huge corporation. They have like the best people and awesome. They have great brand loyalty. Like they could do a gazillion things, but they don't. They focus in on just a really small number of products that they can do really, really well and continue to innovate it and drive the market. So I think there's a lesson there for us.
There is, and you contrast them with Google, who really have kind of spread out lots of different ideas. That many come to scale? Not really, you know. So there's a big contrast there. I think you're right.
Yeah, well, and yeah, the Google example is a great one too. Some of their kind of tangential things have become something big, but a lot of them they try out, they iterate, and ultimately they get rid of it because they decide that was some. I guess when you're really a huge rich corporation like that, you can maybe afford to do that a little bit more. But
but you know, the thing is that what it's unnecessary, right? It's a cost of failure, and it doesn't need to be like that. The degree, the amount of work that you need to do just to provide some sort of boundaries. There's this great Welsh management theorist, Dave Snowden, and Dave talks about bounded diversity, and that's all you want to do. You want to put a few boundaries around this, and then get this incredible interaction of different ideas and possibilities going. And if you do that, then you're much more likely to generate ideas you're going to invest in. And I think the Google example is there's too many examples of them innovating without a clear idea of the customer problem that they're solving. You know, take Google Glass. This is a fabulous example of something that was really cool, but actually for the target consumer, it was, well, what am I going to use that for? When am I going to use that? How will that fit into my life? And they didn't really answer those questions. But what was interesting is that then turns out there is a phenomenal application of Google Glass, which has kept it going in a second life, right? Which is in industrial applications where people want to be able to read manuals or watch videos about how they do a complex procedure in an engineering or different technical environment. And if they had as strong a focus on what sort of customer job or customer outcome they were trying to deliver as they did on the technology, then maybe they would have approached actually bringing it to market in a completely different way.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really good point. So perhaps that leads us into the next stage, and that is incubating.
Yes.
You ideate, you come up with lots of cool ideas, hopefully, but you got to do something with it. And so that takes it into incubation. Tell us a little bit more about that. And really, we've contrasted like Apple versus Google versus many other organizations that, you know, just seem to just dabble in these innovation efforts. How do you go about incubating in an effective way to really weed out, you know, good scalable ideas?
Yeah, that's right. So this is both really easy and really complex, right? So on the really easy level is, I think that we've sort of reached this moment in corporate innovation, maybe innovation more broadly, where we've learned the value of the experiment, right? It's kind of going back to the 17th century and the British-Irish chemist John Boyle, who was the first one to write down an experiment so others could replicate his results, right? And so in the terms of the experimental method in science, this is like a pivotal moment, because now you could actually go replicate what he'd done. And I think that what something like the Lean Startup has done is the same. It said, we now need hypotheses, we need evidence, we need the MVP to find out what people think of the innovation we have. This is a incredible shift, right? So that's the easy side in a way. The hard side is what Steve Blank says himself, which is that in most corporations that turns into innovation theater, right? Why? Well, again, it's back to, you know, are we sure about why we're doing this, and are we really committed? But also it comes down to that the more mature organizations sometimes lose a focus on being able to be disciplined about their use of evidence and to have hypotheses to test, like going into a manager. I used to be a manager in a large corporation, and going in and saying, you know, I'm not quite sure of the answer, but I have two hypotheses I'm going to test. It's like that doesn't run in most places. It's like, tell me what you think, tell me how it's going to work, get it done, right? And I think that that's the cultural challenge of incubation, is how do we learn to do this in a way that's really going to be driven by evidence and not by ego? And if you can do that, then we can be as successful as as Steve is with startups, or Robert Boyle was as a chemist.
Yeah, and the iteration element is so important as we hypothesize. That's what scientists do all the time. I often talk when I'm teaching a change management class or an OD class at the university. I often talk about organizational development and change. It's essentially you're just applying the scientific method within an organizational setting, right?
Good.
I mean,
yes.
there's certainly more to it than that. There's lots of models and all that, but essentially, you boil it down. We're just hypothesizing. We're doing the scientific method,
yes.
and you try to do it. Iterate and fall forward, fail fast. All those cliches. Ultimately, to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and it needs to be evidence based. And everyone says that they want to make evidence-based decisions. Everyone says they want the data. In my experience, though, like you said, ego really drives the day, and they'll pick and they'll cherry pick evidences that they think support what they already want to do, and they'll ignore all the evidence that goes contrary to what they want to do.
Right, exactly, and that's a great link to change management, because I think you're right. And candidly, I think I've learned that more from doing this work the last 20 years in innovation than I think I realized before, because I kind of started more in change and came into the innovation work in this experience at IBM. And I think that you're right. Change management as a body of work often assumes you find the answer, current state, future state, install, right? No, it's not. It's okay, current state, and it's hypotheses about future state and about how we might get there, and then lots and lots of iterations to bring it about, driven by evidence. And that's that is the same, I think.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so let's assume we've done a really good job at the ideation stage in creating systems, mechanisms, culture within the organization to really support the ideation stage. Now we're incubating. We're really, again, we have the mechanisms in place organizationally to make sure that incubation happens in a healthy, sustainable way. Now we find that really good idea that fits with our strategy. We have a clear, customer proposition, value proposition, and now we're going to go about trying to implement it. We're going to try to scale it. Let's talk a little bit about that, including some examples perhaps of where it's gone terribly wrong, despite a really great idea. Because we know it's not enough to have the great idea. It's not enough to even incubate it. Getting it to market and scaling is really hard.
Much more challenging. Absolutely right. Yeah. So there's a few different aspects to this scaling piece. I should say firstly that scaling begins at ideation, right? So the hypotheses, the hunting zones, the sense of the ambition you want to fulfill, all of that happens at the beginning, but it really becomes important later, because it's what gives you confidence at one level that you've made the right selections and you're on the right path. But it also sets the right sort of strategic context that the people are going to be able to rally around. The things that we focus on in scaling is firstly leadership, secondly organization, and then thirdly what's the scaling path, we call it. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So one of the most I think outstanding examples of corporate innovation is by the firm LexisNexis, and LexisNexis is well known for its online legal and news information, and that's a very successful business. Started in the the 60s, I think, really came to the fore in the 70s as kind of the first dial-up internet type service, right? Is very, very innovative in its time. As it matured, it got into the area of sort of personal information and public records information, which it then made available to law enforcement and others who needed to understand who people were, or for ultimately for credit rating agencies and all this kind of stuff. But they had an observation around about 2000, 2001. They observed that if they could link lots of different data sets together, they could build what now has become LexisNexis Risk Analytics. And that's now a business, a sort of a big data business, which is larger than the original business. And they've done that inside of 20 years. And they did it partly by using the assets they've got and partly by acquiring new assets to get there. And so the leadership question here was a lot to do with the CEO of LexisNexis at that point, a guy called Andy Prozis. But then the corporate explorer who worked for him, Jim Peck. And Jim kind of had this idea, he saw what he needed to do, and he was, arrogant enough at some level to pull it through, but smart enough, savvy enough to be able to build an alliance around him to achieve it. The second thing is he needed a separate organization, what we call an ambidextrous organization, right? So one that separates the explorer from the exploiting core, right? So it needs autonomy to act, but it also needs access back into the assets of the core business. And in this case, it was the brand, it was the back office systems, but it was also some of the data and some of the systems that they'd already had. And then this last piece is the scaling path. And in LexisNexis' case, they need to make some acquisitions as well as using their existing assets. And they bought a small company in Florida with a sort of database technology, which gave them this ability to link different assets. And then they bought a large insurance back office systems company, ChoicePoint, which then provided them all the data and customer relationships that they need. And in the US, we're now the beneficiaries of this with the way that if you go to any insurance company, you don't need to input your details. You don't even need to. When I had a small car accident, somebody drove into the side of me one day. I didn't really have to do anything. They knew about it before I did. They sorted the repair, everything. And it's actually LexisNexis that's behind that, and they've moved into other markets as a result. And so you can do this if you've got the corporate explorer leading it with enough autonomy from the core business, but still access to the assets, and then a scaling path that allows them to build their way towards the new entity.
Yeah, excellent. And I mean, it's very woven throughout what you were just saying, but let's be really explicit here for a second. What's the value in doing all of this within an existing organization versus just breaking off, starting your own company and doing something on your own?
And that is a very great question, Jonathan, because to some degree, if it depends on your point of view. Right? If you're an investor, an investor's view to my clients is, why are you doing this? I'll take care of hedging my risk for the future I'll put my shares into Apple and Google and Amazon. I don't need to worry about LexisNexis. Those guys will take care of the future, right? But the thing that loses is, if you take another perspective, I'm on the management team of LexisNexis. Well, I'm actually responsible for an asset, but also for people and for a history, a legacy. And I want to be able to create its future. And so the decision to do this kind of work is partly financial. It turned out to be tremendously profitable and a growth engine for the company. But also it's about being able to create that future. So sometimes, even if these new ventures don't turn out to be as successful as you thought, they still have a contribution to the future organization. So in this instance, that same database technology is now applied back into the legal company to provide them with the ability to do predictive analytics on court cases and be able to have lawyers narrow what judges are going to give what opinions in different situations and so on. And so this sort of shaping of capabilities in one domain, bringing it back into the core is pivotal as well. And you asked earlier about negative examples. Let me just add that as well, because they are more frequent than the positive. There are lots of positive examples, but there's a lot of negatives. GE Digital is a really big one for everyone, because GE from about 2013-14 went into, how do we do digital? How do we get ahead of the industrial Internet of Things? Made a huge investment in lean startup training, all the rest of it. And yet, 2018, Jeff Immelt, the visionary CEO, is ousted. Bill Rue, who was leading GE Digital, leaves, and they close down GE Digital. They're now coming back at it again. But the reason this all unfolded is that they didn't separate the GE Digital out fully from the core business. It was entirely dependent on the existing business. It was a matrix organization, not an ambidextrous one. They invested well ahead of learning. They didn't do the incubation discipline, right? So they were out there building this big platform Predix long before it was really needed. The market still isn't mature for this stuff, right? But they were out there 5 years ahead of the market. Right? And then the culture, right? The culture of show me your short-term results rather than let's test and learn towards an uncertain future and kind of build around that. And that's the two dangers. I think, two companies, same basic field of data analytics, but two very different outcomes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Andrew, for those examples. Thank you for the conversation. It has been a real pleasure. I know the time has flown by, and I need to let you go and get back to your busy day. But before we close for today, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, so changelogic.com, one word, or you can find me Twitter at AJMBins. In terms of sort of books, we have a new edition of my colleague's book, Lead and Disrupt, coming out. And that lands on September 7th, has a really great introduction by Steve Blank, saying basically that he starts by saying this book is a revolutionary document. And I think it's a really powerful description of some of the issues that we've discussed. And then February next year, my own book with Mike and Charles, Corporate Explorer, will come out. So please look out for both of them.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you, Andrew. It has been a real pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, check out the books, look for the upcoming books. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.